Welcome to VIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at viamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. VIA Media, your way.
All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to session two of our Sheroes course on African women resistance leaders. This week, we're going to be moving counterclockwise in our travels through African history geographically. We're going to move from the Nile Valley up to Northwest Africa, and we're going to be talking about Algeria today. Our discussion is going to focus on three movements and three female leaders of resistance at various periods in Algerian history. We're going to talk about the earliest, Dahia al-Kahina, who resisted Arab invasion in the 700s. We're going to talk about Lala Fatma Insomar, who opposed French colonization in the mid-19th century, the 1800s. And not listed here, but we're also going to talk about Zora Drift. Zora Drift was is still alive freedom fighter who fought against the French in the 1950s and 60s when Algeria got independence in 1962. So, let me get it on there. All right, last week, we ended class talking about Sudan and talking about the resistance of Kendake Imani Reines against the forces and troops of Emperor Augustus, and we talked about how she defended her country. We talked about the current situation in Sudan and how the women in Sudan have been leaders in social revolutions and in rebellions all the way up until recent times. Last week, when 2019, we talked about the uprising against Omar al-Bashir. We're going to do the similar pattern as we go further to the northwest of Africa and talk about Algeria. So, when you look at a map like this, which shows ancient kingdoms and empires in Africa, we started here with Kush, Nubia, Ethiopia here. Now we're moving to this region here. Now you'll see there's a big gap as if nothing was happening here, but we're going to talk about what was going on here and the people that lived there. And one of the interesting things about this region and the people that lived in this region and continue to live in this region, they trace their lineage back matrilineally. Strong matriarchs in this region, the founding ancestors of many of the groups of people in this region are women. So we're going to talk about that. And we're going to start, though, by talking about what's going on in Algeria right now. One other thing I'll say as we begin this conversation. This class is about African women resistance leaders. And oftentimes in history and public conversation, there's a tendency to separate North Africa from the rest of the continent, as if for some reason, just because there are Arabs and Turks and other people that live in this region, that is no longer a part of Africa and African history. But that's not the case in this class. This whole thing is Africa, all of this, Madagascar, the islands, this is all Africa. So when we go through African history, we don't make this separation of south of the Sahara history versus north of the Sahara history. That's not what we do with this class. It's all African history. It's all worthy of discussion, and it all will be brought up in this class. So the folks that lived in this region, Arabs, Turks, Tuaregs, Amazigh, and other folks that have migrated into this region. So it's a multi-ethnic, multi-religious space. Algeria is, and we're going to get into all of that history today, or at least some of it, the parts that concern resistance and female leaders. All right, so look at this. There it is. All right. So here's what we talk about in terms of modern political maps. Algeria, 1962 gets independence. 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, a revolution happened in Algeria, and it's referred to as the Revolution of Smiles. It's a very nice name, the Revolution of Smiles. And it was a nice name because it was a nice revolution, relatively peaceful revolution of young people and older activists who, just like in Sudan, which we talked about last week, got together and said, we don't like the direction that this country is going. At the time, the president had announced he was going to run for a 5th term. The people were fed up with the corruption. They were fed up with the clientelism. They were fed up with the unemployment of a highly educated young population. So just like in Tunisia, just like in Egypt, just like in Sudan, the young people came out in the streets and protested. And one thing about this protest, just like we saw in Sudan, Algerian women came out in force, young and old. This is probably the most famous picture of the revolution. It's this young Algerian woman named Melissa Zayed, who is also a ballerina. And another young Algerian woman took this picture. She posted it on Instagram, and it got millions of likes. And it became they call it the ballerina of hope. It's a symbol of hope for the revolution. As a result of this revolution, the president that was seeking a 5th term, the military kind of came up to him and said, yeah, the people have spoken. You need to go ahead and not do this. So he decided not to run. They made some constitutional amendments, but it's still an ongoing. I have 2021. That's when the bulk of it ended. But it's still an ongoing process. The young people are still advocating. The women who, even before Iran popped off in terms of this whole conflict over the hijab, the women in Algeria have been dealing with this as well. Since independence in 1962, and even going back further, Algeria was never a fundamentalist Islamic state. But in the 1990s, you had a group of folks influenced by other Wahhabist groups from Saudi Arabia and other places who wanted to turn Algeria into a fundamentalist Islamic state. And a civil war actually broke out in Algeria in the 1990s, very dark days in Algeria. And those fundamentalist Islamic forces were attempting to force women to wear the hijab. Now, some women in Algeria wear it, some don't. Some men are veiled in Algeria. We'll get to that. We talk about the Tuaregs in southern Algeria. But it was never a mandate. So part of this revolution of smiles has been the young women coming out and say, it's our choice, whether we want to wear the hijab, whether not. It's about choice. It's not about which is right or wrong. It's about who gets to decide. And the young women say, we get to decide. It's also about a better future for young women in terms of education. And Algeria does pretty good in terms of educating women. It's about 70%. Things could be done better in the rural areas, but for the most part, Algeria has been relatively progressive, even going back to the independence movement. And the reason why is because of in the long lineage of Algerian resistance, women have played such a vital role. They're valued as leaders, spiritual leaders, political leaders, and as we're going to talk about today, military leaders. One group of people that heavily supported this revolution of smiles were older women who had participated in Algeria's independence from France. One such woman, one of the most important women, is Zora Drift Bitat, or I'll probably refer to her as Zora Drift during our discussion, because that was her name during the revolution. And she said to the protesters, she said, they were fighting for the same principles we fought for, meaning a country that is governed by its children. And when she says children, not like literal children, but a government that's governed by the young people with fresh ideas, fresh perspectives, that's going to push the country forward. A lot of support was given by women such as Zora. Older women that had fought against the French, that had seen Algeria get independence, that had seen a progressive government, and then seen that government challenged by a repressive, conservative, Islamic fundamentalist government in the 90s, and seeing the setbacks that that caused, and wanting to go back to that time where Algeria was one of the leading progressive countries in the world. Now, when you look at this woman who's now in her 80s, late 80s, I think she's about 86, 87 years old, she doesn't look that frightening. She just looks like a nice older lady. When we get into her life story, you'll know that this is one of the most courageous warriors in African history. In fact, we have her book. If you're really interested in reading it and learning about her life, this is her back in the day. This is the sweet old lady. This is the rebel. And you see that she was arrested by the French. We'll get into her story. But if you want to read her story in more depth, I'll put the link to her book there. But she's in a long line of these female leaders of resistance coming out of Algeria. So let's talk about the ethnic makeup of Algeria. I touched on it, but let's talk about it a little bit more. So the Amazigh, also known as the Berbers, make up the majority of the indigenous population of Algeria. These people have been here since the beginning in this region. And you see the Amazigh population goes throughout many of the countries of North and Northwest Africa, from Mali to Niger, of course, Algeria, Libya, even up to Tunisia. I mean, this entire region, and even these little spots, are all Berber enclaves in North and Northwest Africa. Very important population, very ancient population of people. Another group, just a little bit further south, but some areas are overlap, and even their cultures overlap because they're both nomadic people. They have mastered the highway of the Sahara, so these connections of oases, and then once the camel was introduced to Africa, things really exploded in terms of the trade and economic activity that occurred across the Sahara. Both of these groups were active and leaders in those trades. So the Tuaregs, who live again, Mali, Niger, northern Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Libya, Algeria. So both of these groups have been in these regions for a long time. And the Tuareg are very memorable for, you see them, they're the veiled riders of the Sahara. They often wear traditionally dark blue cloth. They're dyeing of this cloth is one of the key identifiers of this group. When you see a tall black man in all blue that's veiled, they're probably a Tuareg. You see the Amazigh. You'll notice that they come in many colors, many shades, from dark to light, live throughout the Sahara. But one thing about them, they're fiercely independent people. They're fiercely independent people. They value their independence. And when that independence is challenged, they resist. And they've done this from the very beginning. The other thing that you'll notice about them is the presence of very strong women in their nations. So, for the history that we're going to talk about today, what are the sources that we're using to recreate it, to talk about it? And again, this is just a general overview. So if you want more details on this history, if you want more sources, go to our course website. You can use them a lot. We're going to introduce another course website in a few weeks. Things are being transferred over, but the old one will still be active. So you can read the secondary sources for this information. But in terms of primary sources, the written record, Arabic sources and Roman sources talk about the Amazigh, talk about the Tuaregs, talk about the people that lived in Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya in ancient times. And then, of course, we have the oral history of the Amazigh and the Tuaregs. One of the earliest historical figures of the Tuaregs is a woman named Ten Hanin, who is also referred to the mother of us all. In the oral tradition of the Tuareg, she migrated to the region from somewhere around Morocco. She's so important that we don't even get the name of the father of us all. Her story completely revolves around her and her daughters. She migrates to the area. She sets up a kingdom around these oases in southern Algeria, and her daughters then go on to inherit her kingdom. And many of the tribes of the Tuareg trace their lineage to Ten Hanin, and we have her grave. And it's been studied by scholars, and she lived somewhere around 500 CE. Now, of course, there's people have been in the region before that, but she's considered the most important ancient ancestor of the Tuaregs. And again, like I said, in the narrative, there's no mention of who the man is that she had these children with or anything like that. It's just about her. And that matrilineal and matriarchal dimensions of Tuareg society carried on until very recent times. So very important. And her grave is I think it's a UNESCO site. I got to double check that, but it's definitely protected by the government. So Ten Hanin, the mother of us all, one of the most important ancestors. The one that we're going to talk about though first is she lived about 250, 300 years later, and that's Dahia Al-Kahina, and she's actually Amazigh. So whereas Ten Hanin is Tuareg, the Amazigh a little bit further north, we're talking about Dahia Al-Kahina. And we talked about her in our last class, actually. And we talked about the Arab invasion of North Africa following the death of the Prophet Muhammad and the expansion of the Arab Empire under the first caliphs. But in all Algerian resistance, her name is often invoked. Dahia Al-Kahina actually means the sorceress. So her name is Dahia. Al-Kahina means the sorceress because for the Arab invaders, they looked at her as almost like a witch. Like, how is this woman able to influence so much? She must have some type of extra spiritual capacity to make these people fight the way that they fight, to follow her leadership the way that they follow her leadership. Some ancient sources even said that she might have been Jewish. Some said that she may have been Christian because the Christianity was highly influential in this region, and as well as the Jewish diaspora as well. But neither one of those have been substantiated by historical evidence, whether she was Christian or Jewish. But what we do know from the oral tradition of the Amazigh is that she lived around this time. She was a member of the Jawara tribe, and she was fighting against Arab invasion. So during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, you had two major empires in the region. You had the Romans, who operated out of Constantinople. So these are the Byzantine Romans. By this time, we're talking about 600, 650. The Western Roman Empire kind of already fallen into disarray. So the bulk of the Roman Empire, the richness of the Roman Empire is in this region. And then you had the Persian Empire, the Neo-Persian Empire in this part over here. The Arabs were disunited until Islam came around. Islam comes, the revelation of the Prophet comes, he unites the Arabs, and they stop fighting each other. The Prophet dies, and then they decide, well, let's just start taking over these other areas. So in a very quick amount of time, the Prophet dies in 632, about 100 years later, the Arabs have conquered most of this region. You can see from this map what they conquered. So, but anyway, before we get into the conquering, once they get united, the Persians and the Romans had been fighting each other in this region for a while, weakening themselves. They weren't ready for a third opponent. It's like a WWE match. It's a triple threat match. They weren't ready. They weren't ready for another opponent to come with the Arabs. And the Arabs could fight because they had spent so much time fighting each other. They had mastered camel cavalry. They knew how to fight. So with these two empires weakened, it was easy for the Arabs to rise up and take over. They come into Egypt. In fact, they're almost invited into Egypt because the Egyptian population is upset with the Romans because they have a disagreement over Christianity. So the Arabs come in and basically kick the Romans out, but then take over themselves. And now they want to push their way further into Africa. They try to go into Nubia, they're stopped. We talked about that in our last class. But as they're making their way into North Africa, they're going to come in contact with a group of people that can fight just as well as they, excuse me. Because the Arabs' advantage over the Persians and the Romans is that the Romans and Persians weren't used to fighting a swift cavalry of desert dwellers that knew how to use that to their advantage. The folks they're coming up against in North Africa, the Amazigh and the Tuaregs, are just like them. They're desert dwellers. They have cavalry. They know how to fight in the desert. They know all those techniques. And they're fiercely independent. So when outsiders come in, they're ready to fight. They have been fighting against the Romans. They had been fighting each other. So now they're about to fight the Arabs. So the Arabs are making their way. They've taken over Egypt. They're making their way further west. And now they come in contact with Dahia. So let's talk about who she was. She was the daughter of a ruler of Tabeta, the son of the Tifan of the Jawara tribe. So these were some of the main leaders of the Amazigh or Berbers. She had replaced the leader Kusala, who had died. And then around 690, she battled Hassan ibn Numan. And she's about 50 years old at this time. So Hassan is the general tasked by the Caliph to fight and extend Arab presence into North Africa. So she's fighting him in battle. She's uniting the Amazigh in a battle against these invaders, the Arabs, and she's winning. She is winning these battles. The Arabs don't know what to do with her because they never come up against an opponent like her before, somebody that matches them in terms of desert fighting. So the Arabs are like, what do we do? She's so successful that she captures a number of the Arab generals. One of them, named Khalid, she makes the mistake of being nice to. So she captures Khalid. The other generals that she captured, when the Arabs decided they were going to retreat, she actually let them go. She let them go and back, and they retreated back to Egypt. She thinks that they probably won't come back for a while. At least we've beat them, so if they come back, we'll just beat them again. But she kept one of the generals, Khalid. Now, depending on which story you hear, there's been movies made about her. There's been books written about her. In order to sensationalize it, some people say, well, she fell in love with Khalid. So this is why she kept Khalid behind. It turned out to be a mistake. She kept Khalid, and Khalid was able to reconnect with his Arab generals in Egypt through some type of correspondence. And he was able to tell them about what she was planning, what she was doing, the size of her troops, basically giving intelligence. This would be her downfall because the Arabs would come back. So after being roundly defeated in a number of battles in the region, they eventually go back to Egypt, get more forces, and then make another run. Now with the intelligence provided to them by Khalid, Hassan comes back and continues to fight. So her first mistake in this fight was not letting Khalid. She should have let Khalid go or killed Khalid, but she didn't kill Khalid. Her second mistake was this: when she realizes that the Arabs are coming back, she doesn't see them as a group that wants to take over the entire region. She sees them as thugs and marauders that want treasure. So what she does, her second mistake, she tells her people, we're going to burn down all the crops. We're going to destroy the crops. That way, there'll be nothing for the Arabs to eat. They'll leave and they'll go back to Egypt. They won't bother us anymore. So we got to destroy everything. In the short term, we can replant things, but we got to destroy everything because they're coming for plunder. That was the mistake. When she tried to force her people to do that, many of them turned on her. They said, well, we don't want to starve, so we'll just submit to the Arabs because, at least we won't starve. And that's what happened. A lot of her people went over to the side of the Arabs. With the intelligence provided by Khalid, with the desertion of a lot of her people, she had to put up one last stand. And her last stand happened somewhere around what's modern Tunis. An old amphitheater that had been built by the Romans, because the Romans had been in this region for a long time, ever since the fall of Carthage. The Romans had been there. They built an amphitheater, and it's there that she decided to wage her last fight, heroic last fight against the Arabs. Before the fight, she told her sons, she said, look, I don't know if I'm gonna make it out of this alive. So what I want you to do, I want you to go over to the Arabs. Just submit to the Arabs and you can live to fight another day. But as for me and these other remaining troops, we're gonna fight it out to the end. And that's exactly what she did. She fought until she was killed. But that initial resistance that she had against the Arabs, and then that final courageous last stand went down in Algerian history. And for centuries afterwards, people would remember the name of Dahia al-Kahina. The Arabs would write about it. They said, this is the fiercest woman we've ever come up against. Her sons would eventually, they did join the Arab army. That army would then transform into a mostly Amazigh army by the time that they're ready to cross the Straits of Gibraltar and go into Spain and Portugal. And the establishment of the Moorish domination of Spain and Portugal resulted from this in the year 711. but a formidable fighter. She made some tactical errors, but not before she was able to hold off the Arabs for years and have some semblance of unity among the Amazigh people. So a name that you should know, a name that you should remember, and one of the most important figures in ancient African history. Um, with that, we'll take our first break, and then we'll come up to more recent times and we'll talk about the resistance against the French, both at the onset of colonization as well as during the 1960s. So let's see if we have any questions. Daniel, is there anything in the chat or does anybody have their hand up to ask a question?
David, go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That's good. Awesome. Dr. Ledbetter and Daniel, thank you very much for putting on these classes. They're phenomenal and I think life-changing. So thanks again for that. Concerning this particular series where you're putting the focus on Sheroes, it appears to me as if we're trying to put the emphasis on what women have accomplished in history and highlight that because it doesn't typically get called out in normal or typical narrations of history, unlike your class. Your class, you do a very balanced review of history, but typically if you go somewhere else, women are not uplifted or considered equals or peers, even though that is intuitionally self-evident.
Mm-hmm.
So the question then becomes, how would are there any resources out there where an individual can check their biases and see if their programming is, how do I put this nicely? Can check if you're leaning one way or another, and are there resources out there where you can verify that if you're looking at women as a subclass, or not?
That's a good question. I can't think of a specific resource, and if one exists, I would love to know about it as well. But I think it's just a matter of, as a scholar, as a presenter, you have to be conscious of your own biases, and do a lot of self-reflection about what it is that you're presenting, to make sure that, and you have to know your audience. You have to know that you're not leaving anything out. And you just got to be honest, because if you really look at this history, and sometimes it can be hard to find unless you, like you said, you have to be explicit in looking for it. Because, for instance, they have this book here that is it's called Wars of Imperial Conquest in Africa, by Bruce Vandervoort, I think is how you say his name. So in this book, you will read about the Algerian the French conquest of Algeria, European conquest of a bunch of other places, and you don't get the names of any of the people that I'm going to talk about today. It's as if they didn't exist. You have to actually go in and type in women in resistance, and then you'll get information. But in things like this, you don't. So as a researcher, you have to set out in your mind before you even get started that I know this is probably going to be a question I'm going to have to ask, because and then present it. So you have to go in with that mindset, like, yeah, more than 51% of the world's population is women. So we should make sure that we look for this and then make sure that we present it. But I wish there was a tool, yeah, because that would be great. Like if you could just put in your journal article or your lecture and just say, am I covering everything that I need to cover? Yeah, but I don't know of one. But I wish there was. And I want to ask some of my friends if they've heard of anything like that or any tools that you can use to check that biases. And it's not only women. I mean, other social realities, whether it's class, whether it's region. Like I said at the beginning, oftentimes we talk about Africa, we act like North Africa doesn't exist. It's not. It's just some Arab part of the Arab world, but it's not. So yeah, we just got to make sure we ask those questions. That's a good one though. Anything in the chat, Daniel? Any other hands up?
There's nothing in the chat, and I don't see any more hands right now.
Okay. All right. So we'll get back into it. That's good though. Moving forward in time, about how many years is that? That's where my math comes in. So if that happened is about 1,100 years later. So now in Algeria, you have a mixed population of people in Algeria. The population now is starting to look like what the population looks like. The population in 1830 is about looking like what it looks like now. You got Tuaregs and Amazigh. You got Turks. So Ottoman Turks have taken over the region. You have Arabs. And you have a spattering of Europeans as well. 1830, Algeria is under the control of the Ottoman Turks. So if we go back to this slide, you'll see that in this period, around 600, the area that's now Turkey was controlled by the Romans. Well, later on, Muslims would take over in Constantinople. The name would be changed to Istanbul. The Byzantine would become Turkey, and a new empire would emerge around the 1400s. Around 1440, I think, is when Constantinople fell. The Turks that take over, the Muslim Turks that take over, eventually take over Egypt and a lot of North Africa. And they're Muslim. They allow the people in Algeria to have pretty much free reign over what goes on in the interior, but they control the coast. It's an older map. Let me see if I can get to it. Yeah, they basically control the coast, which is called the Barbary Coast. And that name is going to become very familiar, very important in a second. So the Ottomans are there. They control the coast. They pretty much leave the interior to the people of Algeria. They don't really get too involved in the tribal politics inside of Algeria. As long as people pay their taxes, and they're of the same religion too, as the most part, because now most of the people in Algeria are Muslim. So the Ottoman Turks, ruling from Turkey, don't directly get involved, control this coast. One of the things that the Ottoman rulers in the region also turn a blind eye to are the pirates that operate in this region. The region was known for piracy. So when European merchant ships from France and England, and then even later on the United States are trying to do business here, they're taxed by these pirates who often board the ships, they take the treasures. Sometimes they even take white people into slavery. Now, I don't want you to think that that is any way equivalent to the millions of Africans that went to the West and to the East. But every now and again, white folks will be put into the enslavement in North Africa. Oftentimes, they'd just be kept prisoner until somebody paid their ransom, and then they got released. But these pirates were operating here from in the 1700s and even into the early 1800s. But by the time we get to 1830, however, by the time of Fatma's birth, that piracy had kind of ended. It had pretty much been quelled by both the British and the Americans. Now, you know, it's the time. This is around 1830. America gets its independence from England in 1776. They declare independence. They fight the Revolutionary War. And then one of the first things that the Americans do is they want to put an end to the piracy in that part of Africa because their merchant ships are being harassed. The information that we're going to talk about today, what I'm talking about right now, comes from French colonial sources as well as the oral history of the Amazigh. So the French at this time, or let me go back. So the Americans send their Marines into this region to end the piracy, and they're very successful at that. In fact, one of the songs of the U.S. Army says something about the Barbary Coast, and I didn't know why it said that until like later on when I was an adult. I was like, oh, that's why they mentioned it. It was the first U.S. Venture outside of the continent, the first international war that the U.S. ever fought. It was very early in their history. But anyway, the reason why I'm talking so much about the piracy is because in 1830, the French decide that they're going to invade Algeria. When we talk about colonization in Africa, this is the first war of the true colonial period in Africa. So let me go back a little bit, because over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about this era a lot. Slavery begins, the transatlantic slave trade, that slavery begins in the 1440s. It starts with the Portuguese and would go all the way into the late 19th century. Brazil was the last place to end slavery in 1885. That European presence in Africa was relegated primarily to the coast of West Africa, coast of East Africa. You had Dutch and British presence in South Africa, but for the most part, Europeans were confined to the coast. Fast forward to the 1800s. Now, because Britain has gotten fat off the slave trade through its colonies, through its banks, all that, Britain wants to end the slave trade. There was an abolitionist movement in Britain. They want to end the slave trade. So that becomes a context for doing different things in Africa. The idea that we're doing this to end the slave trade. We're going to go into Africa. We're going to take over these kingdoms we don't like because we don't like the fact that they're enslaving African people, even though you made your money enslaving African people. So that was one of the contexts. Second context, the end piracy. That was another one of the reasons why the Europeans, in this case, the French, come into Algeria, because they want to end piracy, even though the Americans had pretty much done that 2 decades before. There's a French king. You guys know your French history. They had the French Revolution in the late 1700s. By the time we get to the 1820s, 30s, the monarchy is back. The Bourbon family is back on the throne, but the king isn't really that popular. So what do unpopular leaders do to make themselves more popular and try to deflect the negative press from them? They invade another country. Invading countries are supposed to give the rulers prestige and to draw public attention away from their mismanagement or any other perceived flaws that they may have. So the king decides that he is going to invade Algeria to number one, end piracy. Number two, there had been a scuffle between the Ottoman ruler of Algiers and a French nobleman. Essentially, and I'll try to get this as straight as possible, but the Ottoman governor, so the guy that was tasked by the Ottomans to rule this area, he was owed a debt by some Jewish traders in Algiers. Those traders said, we can't pay you the debt because these French people owe us money. So once we get the money from these French traders, we'll get it to you and then we can pay our debt. So he said, cool. And he's waiting, he still didn't get his money. So he goes straight to the French people, the French guy, and he's like, hey, these Jews say you owe them money, pay them so that they can pay me. They get into it, they're going back and forth, and apparently the Turkish governor has a fly swatter, and he slaps the French guy in the face with the fly swatter. This set off an international incident. So the French king said, we want revenge from this Muslim autocratic ruler that had the audacity to slap one of our noblemen with a fly swatter. And then on top of that, this guy is supporting the piracy that's robbing our ships, that's putting virtuous white women into slavery, and who knows what they're doing. They're probably selling them to Africans. So this was all the justification that the French king used to amass tens of thousands of troops to invade Algeria. And they take the coast relatively easily because the Turks are getting relatively weak at this time. By the time we get to the middle of the 1800s, the Turks are losing ground in a lot of places. But they lose that. They lose these areas on the coast. But the French aren't done. The French don't just want the coast. That's a big part of it. they realized that there's a lot of fertile land in Algeria. You could grow olives, you could grow grapes, you could grow different things. The French say, okay, we got this rising urban population in France. And this is going to be everything that happens in Algeria that I'm going to be talking about today are patterns that we'll see throughout the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th century in terms of the justifications for and the methods used to colonize Africa. Everything the French did, the other Europeans are going to copy. The British, the Belgians, the Germans, the Portuguese, so on and so forth. So they say there's fertile land. We got this problem in France. We have these urban populations of all these poor people that keep uprising and overthrowing kings. If we can get some of them out of the country, give them some cheap land, then we can, we can use it as a pressure release valve. So whenever time the tension builds up in France, we say, oh, there's some land in Algeria. You can go live there and be happy. So they pushed their way further into the interior, into the land of the Amazighs, into the land of the Arab tribes and other folks in Algeria that are ready to fight them, because the Turks basically stayed on the coast. They didn't interfere with what was going on here. As long as the people paid their taxes, they had the same religion. They were all Muslim. Now you have this invading Christian army that is coming to take over land. And the French are incredibly brutal in their invasion of Algeria. The first person to put up resistance, Emir Abd al-Qadir. Al-Qadir was a religious leader who became, as a result of this, a military leader. And he started organizing the people to fight against the invading French. And he was successful at various points in time. But then the French upped their brutality and started committing what they called the raid. In French, it's razzia. What that was about, they realized that they couldn't defeat the troops of Al-Qadir outright, particularly because they fought a guerrilla war against the French. They knew they couldn't fight the French in a traditional, I'll line my troops up, you line your troops up, we'll shoot at each other, that line falls and we'll just see what happens. No, they fought hit and run tactics against the French. The French realized they couldn't win a war like that, so they said, instead of just attacking the troops, we're going to attack the entire population. And in fact, this general here, General Bougoud, and you guys know I don't speak French, so I don't know how his last name is spelled. Frankly, don't care because he's an invader. But this French general, he had this to say. He said, in terms of the tactics that he used, attacking civilians, burning down crops, burning down villages. He said, far from being ineffective or dangerous, such liquidations, such as cave massacres, what they would do, they would drive Algerians into caves. The people would be in the caves to protect, their families, and the French would then light fires to the entrance of the caves. So the people either had the option of staying in the cave and suffocating to death, or trying to run out through flames. So that was one of the tactics that they used. Says, far from being ineffective or dangerous, such liquidations would finally convince the natives that they had no choice but to accept the yoke of conquest and to devote themselves to that agriculture and commerce which rapidly heal the ravages of combat. See, we use this terror to make sure that they submit. That's what he's saying. He went on to say, we never got anything from these people except through force. We often tried to bring them around by means of persuasion, but it didn't work. Either they never responded or they told us we would first have to shoot it out and that if we won, they would submit. So he's saying it's only force, which should come as no surprise because you're invading somebody's country. But this was his justification for the total war that he waged against the Algerians. Burning of crops, destroying of peaceful villages, all of this, killing men, women, and children. The Algerians didn't take this sitting down. And although there were times where their main resistance leader, Emir al-Qadir, had sued for peace and he used tactical diplomacy with the French, there was one fighter Fatma. Lala means lady. Lady Fatma of Somer. She and her brothers knew no surrender and no retreat from the French. She was born in the western part of the country. Although I have her picture there, she's born in the western part of the country, in a mountainous area. She was born to a family of Islamic scholars in the Sufi order of Islam, a more mystical version of Islam. She had what was called baraka, spiritual power. People would come from miles away to converse with her, to get advice from her about various things in life from a young age. And she dies when she's 30, so from a very young age. And she shows a rebellious spirit from a young age. She was supposed to be married to this guy, and she tried it out for a little while. She's probably about 15, 16 years old. But then she realized she didn't want to be married to him anymore, so she left and ran away to the house of her brother because she refused to be married to this man anymore. The guy never granted her a divorce. So throughout the rest of her life, even though she had other suitors because she was apparently very beautiful. She had other suitors. The husband refused to grant her a divorce. But anyway, that just shows her rebellious spirit. When the French came, so they had been decimating the country throughout the 1830s, 1840s. When they got to her area in the 1840s, she and her brothers organized the resistance against the French. She used her spiritual power. She used her organizing skills to unite the people in their fight against the French. She recruited young men into the M. Seblim. The M. Seblim. These are people that were willing to fight to the death for their freedom, and they did. She and her brothers forced the French to retreat in a series of battles in 1854. Very, very successful in her battles against the French. They had to send different generals out to fight her because she was a master of mountainous warfare, a master that hit those hit and run tactics. The French, they couldn't defeat her. It wasn't until she was double crossed by the French that she was actually defeated. Her most famous victory, the Battle of Tashkent, July 18th, 1854. I have that there. This is one of the most important battles in African military history. It completely routed the French. The French were forced to retreat, and they sued for peace after this battle. The French said, all right, we'll leave you guys alone. We won't come back. We won't fight. We sign a peace treaty. It was that treaty that would be broken by the French. The French would eventually come back. They started with about, I think, 12,000 troops in Algeria, and that would balloon to about 37,000 troops in Algeria. France had about a third of its national army in Algeria as a result of the victories of Fatma Somor and the other Algerian freedom fighters. When the French broke the peace treaty, and they brought in all those tens of thousands of more troops and continued even more brutal ways their warfare against the Algerians. She was finally captured. She was imprisoned, and she died in prison. But she never surrendered to the French. She never surrendered her people. She just kept fighting until she was finally captured, and she died as a result of her imprisonment. But very important figure. Very important figure. Again, just like Dahia, she's another one of these figures that's remembered in Algerian history. In fact, this image here shows you one of the many statues to her throughout Algeria. She's revered as a resistance fighter who used her spiritual power, her military organization skills to hold off the French. And if it wasn't for her belief in French humanity, because when she signed the peace treaty, she assumed that the other side would uphold their side of the agreement, but they didn't. The tactics that the French would use for remaining of this conquest of Algeria, again, hallmarks of what you would see throughout the rest of Africa. Algeria is the first true colony of Europeans in Africa, the way we think about colonization. So in the 1800s, the French used divide and conquer. They used total war. They used what we would now, they used rape as a weapon of war to terrorize the Algerian population because they knew how much respect that they had for their women and how much they valorized their women, such as Dahia and going all the way back to Tin Annis. So the French used rape as a weapon of war. They used, eventually, they would use French civilization as a weapon of war. We'll talk about that in a second. But they used all of these tactics: divide and conquer, rape as a weapon of war, total war, fighting against peaceful populations. All of these tactics would all be copied. If we're talking about Ghana, if we're talking about Congo, if we're talking about Kenya, Zimbabwe, South Africa, all the other places that colonization would be in Africa, all use similar tactics. So Algeria gives us this blueprint, and it also gives us a blueprint of resistance, and particularly these women that resisted. So as we move forward up in time, the Algerians continued to resist. They never stopped resisting. Now some of this resistance would be more dramatic than others, such as in the 1870s, there was another major uprising. So they always resisted, but the French held strong and controlled the country all the way up until World War II. So what we're going to talk about now is what Zora Drift did. As I mentioned, she was the elder at the beginning of this class. I said it was supportive of what the youth were doing in 2019. She writes a book. So if you want to know about her life and her fight against the French, I recommend this book, Inside the Battle of Algiers. And I actually recommend that movie as well. It's an old movie called The Battle of Algiers. It's in black and white. It's in French. It was banned in France when it was made in the 1960s. It was one of the most important movies that talks about African revolutions, The Battle of Algiers. She writes this book. And in the book, she talks about her early life and what made her a revolutionary. So she comes from a pretty well-to-do family in Algeria. Her father was a scholar, and he sent her from the countryside to the capital, to Algiers, to study at a French boarding school because he wanted his daughter to get the best possible education. And this is just one of the interactions that she has at the school. She writes in the book, and I like to read this because this should ring true to many Black people that go to white schools. She said, "Those years at school, all those discussions taught me much about life, culture, and lifestyles of Europeans, including their ways of thinking and seeing us. One day, my friend Olympe, back from the weekend with her parents in the town of Bertua, recounted to us the first football match she had attended, pitting a European team against a quote-unquote native one. When asked where she was sitting and whether the crowd was mixed, she answered spontaneously, 'Oh, but in Bertuta, we're always on one side and the rats are on the other.' I looked at her, taken aback at the brutal realization that in her eyes and those of the other friends participating in the discussion, I too was a rat. Realizing immediately that I understood her meaning, she added, 'Oh, but Zora, you're not like the others.' How many times have people heard that? She said, 'You're not like the others.' She said, the other Algerians, they're rats. We don't sit with them. But you come to our school, you're civilized, you're not like the others.' How many Black students have heard that from white colleagues? She said, 'My mother's words came back to me, reminding me of the reality that my friendships with Europeans, however sincere they may be, would all be smashed against the wall that separated our two existences. This did not prevent me from continuing to spend time and even befriend my classmates, but I never again lost sight of that infamous wall.' So this is her experience, and she talks about in the book the racism that she experienced as an Algerian at this French boarding school in her country. She's 10 years old in 1945 when the French again showed their inhumanity. 1945, it's an important year. It's the year that World War II ends. France painted itself as a victim during World War II. So during the Great European Tribal War, the Second Great European Tribal War, France got occupied by Germany. Even though a lot of French collaborated with the Germans, particularly the French in Algeria, they painted themselves, oh, we're the big victims. We were invaded by the Germans. So when the war ended, and during the war, the French had forced many Algerians at gunpoint to join their military to fight in their tribal war against the Germans. They forced them to. They took people from their homes, mothers crying, trying to hold their sons as the French were taking them to be drafted into their tribal war. So the French are celebrating the end of World War II, and they forced the Algerians to come out to celebrate the end of this war. But the Algerians are saying, wait a minute, you got invaded by the Germans. They took you over relatively easily. And then in a little while later, you lost at Dien Bien Phu in what's now Vietnam. So you're weak. But they really, really started to advocate for independence and better treatment May 8th, 1945. The Algerian masses come out, particularly in eastern Algeria, and they're peacefully, and I want to make this clear, they're peacefully protesting for better treatment. They say, we fought for you. We sent our sons to fight and die in your tribal war for quote unquote freedom and all this. And this would be a refrain all over Africa and all over places where African people lived as descendants. In the United States, in Canada, Black people came back fighting in the European tribal war, and they said, we fought for you. We want better rights. We want civil rights. We want human rights. We want to be treated as equal because we died fighting for you. Same as what the Algerians said. Well, the French responded to these peaceful protests by killing 45,000 Algerians in one day. 45,000. So they just got done fighting their war. And now, because people are peacefully asking for better rights, they're slaughtered in the street. Men, women, and children. Daniel, if you wouldn't mind, could you please play that video dealing with the events of May 8th, 1945? The other one, Daniel.
Today marks the 76th anniversary of the massacre of 45,000 Algerians by French armed forces in Sétif and Ghent. On May 8, 1945, Europe was celebrating the end of World War II after Germany had finally surrendered to the Allied forces. The French and Algeria mobilized locals to commemorate the victory, but the timing coincided with months of unrest and the rise of anti-colonial sentiment among Algerians who had been subjected to brutal French colonial rule since 1830. It's estimated some 4,000 protesters took to the streets of Sétif in northern Algeria, demanding civil rights. Many tribes and organizations joined the protests as their numbers swelled across the city. Some demonstrations included pro-independence elements, resulting in people bearing placards and Algerian flags that were banned at the time. In response, the French gendarmerie, under the order of General Duval, opened fire on protesters, killing thousands of unarmed civilians. What followed were violent clashes between the two groups, as the French armed forces resorted to ground offensives and area bombing villages as a means to control the population. The violence continued till May 22nd, 1945, when many Algerian tribes finally surrendered. 45,000 Algerian men, women, and children had been killed around the region of Sétif, Guelma, and Farat, compared to only 102 French casualties. The massacre became the impetus behind Algeria's anti-colonial movement that eventually led to the country's War of Independence in 1954. The war would claim a further 1.5 million Algerian lives before independence was finally attained in 1962. May 8th has now been marked as an official national day of remembrance in Algeria, and its first commemoration will be led by President Abdelmadjid Tebboune, who has previously referred to France's colonization of Algeria as a crime against humanity. As the country mourns, rallies are expected in Sétif and the capital Algiers to mark the occasion.
All right, thank you, Daniel. So that was the starting off point. And the 45,000 in those short weeks, men, women, and children. So I'm saying that because what we're going to talk about next will make this make sense. So she was 10 years old when this happened. She says, though, that the people in Algeria, after this happened and going up to 1954, realized that because of the occupation, because the French had been defeated in Indochina, that they were not invincible and that the French could be beaten and the French could be kicked out of Algeria. So she goes to the school. She ends up graduating in the year 1954. She graduates high school in 1954 and is going to go to university. She's going to start university November 22nd, 1954. But a very important event happened November 1st, 1954, All Saints' Day in Algeria. This is when a previously underground organization, the National Liberation Front, in French, the FLN, emerges. These are the Algerians that say, now we're ready to fight the war against the French. We're going to avenge what happened in 1945. So years of planning, underground cells developing, a leadership structure emerging, organization. So finally, on All Saints' Day, November 1st, 1954, all over the country, explosions, bombings, fights occurred, coordinated. And this was a symbol, this was a message to the people in Algeria. And Drift talks about it in her book. She says, her and her brothers got the newspaper that day and they read about these attacks and they knew that the war was on and they were happy. And they were, people in her village were happy about this. Even her mother she couldn't read French, but when she saw what the young people were talking about, was happy that this war was about to actually go on. While in college, Drift makes connections with the FLN, with the freedom fighters. And they said, we're going to use you. We want you to fight in the war, because she wanted to fight in the war. And she said, and they said, but you have a very particular role to play. You went to the French boarding school. You dress like a European sometimes when you're in Algiers. Not when you're at home, but when you're in Algiers, you know how to dress like a European. You know how they think. You know how they operate. We want you to bring the war to the French, because once this happened, November 1st, 1954, much of the fighting was against the Algerian population in the rural areas. But the French, the settlers that lived in places like Algiers and other major cities along the coast, and the war wasn't even really hitting them. That was until Zora Drift goes to the milk bar. One day in 1957, Zora Drift, her friend Sadia, who also attended the French boarding school, and another Algerian woman whose name is escaping right now, but another great freedom fighter. They go into Algiers, into the French quarter, where all the French settlers are hanging out. They walk in. She walks into a bar. Her other friend walks into. Where did she go? One went into the airport, and one went to another major area where the French would be. And no one batted an eye. They didn't look like the typical Algerian women. They were dressed like European women. And they sat their bags down where they were, the places that they entered, sat for a little bit, and then walked out. Then boom, those bags exploded. They, in particular, hers at this bar with these French youth and everybody was hanging out, killed 3 people, wounded 12 others. All 3 of these bombings happening at the same time. The French were beside themselves. They didn't know what was going on. This was the beginnings of bringing the fight to the settlers, who thought that the war was not going to touch them. The French painted them as terrorists. The French painted them as the same way the U.S. would paint Al-Qaeda or anybody else later on. Because they said, how could you do this? These are innocent people that you bombed, and they were just there to have a good time. As if they completely forgot about May 8th, 1945, and all the other atrocities that have been occurring since 1830. It's when they fought back that they were considered, that the Algerians are considered terrorists. Zora Drift was successful in her activity. She did it. She she even goes to after the bomb goes off. She goes to the house of a French woman that she knew in Algiers, still with the masquerade, like, oh, I can't believe that this happened. It was brilliant acting. She keeps working with the FLN, but then the French, after these bombings and other events, and the FLN is fighting, the French step up their torture campaign in Algeria. They torture many people. And again, when they found female resistance fighters, they used rape as a weapon of war. Again, there's countless stories of Algerian women, even the ones that weren't freedom fighters, raped by French troops, raped by French police as a way to terrorize the population. She's arrested. She spends 5 years in prison, and she's able to write a manuscript in prison called "The Death of My Brothers," which continues to inspire the freedom fighters that weren't locked up. This war, one of the most brutal wars for independence in Africa, would bring out some great African personalities like Ahmed Ben Bella, like Frantz Fanon, the psychiatrist from Martinique that had come to Algeria actually as part of the French colonial project. And he was treating French soldiers that were torturing Algerians, but he was treating them for the psychological toll that the torture was taking on them. And Fanon realized that I'm on the wrong side of this fight. And then he actually joins the FLN and he meets with people like Zora Drift and others. So Drift, the other women that fought, they used this war, which they ultimately won in 1962. The French were forced to leave Algeria and Algeria got independence. Settler colonies such as this are always the hardest to liberate because the French that live there, and at this point there's millions of French that have come and taken land in Algeria and live in Algeria, are forced to leave. We're going to see this play out again in South Africa. We're going to see this play out again in Zimbabwe and in Kenya. These are the places that are hardest to get Europeans out because they come to live. So Zora Drift, her other colleagues were some of the most influential fighters in this movement against French colonialism. The last thing I'll show today before we close up, I want you to hear from Zora Drift herself. So you can hear what she says, how she recounts, why she fought, and her thinking about it. So Daniel, if you wouldn't mind pulling up that video of Zora Drift.
Le sentiment profond que j'étais algérienne, que cette terre était la terre de nos ancêtres et qu'elle était occupée par un peuple qui nous était étranger, et puis surtout le sentiment profond et que c'était un devoir pour nous de reconquérir notre pays. C'était très frappant, vous aviez un pays qui était en guerre, mais dont une partie vivait dans la paix totale, la sécurité absolue, et dont l'autre était soumise à un traitement extrêmement terrible. Alors que la partie occupée par les Français continuait à vivre comme s'il n'y avait pas de guerre. Et donc, nous avions dans nos groupes armés ce qu'on appelait des fidèles, si vous voulez, les volontaires de la mort, qui allaient dans les quartiers européens commettre des actions armées contre les commissariats de police, contre les casernes, enfin, des objectifs qui étaient jugés par notre organisation comme essentiels. Et très souvent, ces jeunes qui allaient dans ces quartiers européens accomplissaient leur mission, mais ils n'en revenaient jamais. Voilà pourquoi nous avons Samir Ardali et moi-même, dès que nous avons été acceptés notre organisation de combat qui était le Front de Libération Nationale, nous avons proposé à nos chefs de nous intégrer dans l'armée de libération nationale, les FIDAI, et de nous confier des actions armées sous des formes diverses à accomplir dans la ville européenne. Et nous, qui avions fait un cursus scolaire et universitaire comme des jeunes européens, nous avions un look d'Européens, nous connaissions la langue, donc on passait très facilement dans la partie européenne de la ville pour des Européennes. Donc nous estimions que nous avions plus de chances de réaliser l'action qui nous était confiée
All right, thank you for that, Dave. Just wanted you to hear a little bit from her. So, freedom fighters. So we use the term, but the story of Zora Drift, what she was up against, her sisters in the struggle, what they were up against if they got captured. I mean, death was great compared to the torture that the French would put on people when they captured. She actually got, I wouldn't say lucky, but a lot of her colleagues didn't end up making it out of the struggle the way that she did. But she would go on, and in independent Algeria, she became vice president of the Senate, and continues today, just like was mentioned at the beginning of the class, to advocate for true social revolution, and for a place for not only women but young people as a whole to inherit the richness that is Algeria. So she's a freedom fighter. She's a resistance leader. And her story of fighting against the French through any means is one that we should know and honor. And she's in the line of the women that we're going to be talking about over the next couple of weeks. So we'll stop there today. I'll take two questions that people might not mind being recorded, then we'll turn the recording off for any announcements. I will say this before we turn the recording off. Next week, Jaku Combat is putting on a community build session as part of our mentorship program. This month's focus is on our young men and brotherhood. So if you know any young men that want to come out, we'll be at 211 Bronson at 2:30. There'll be food. We'll be joined by the Brotherhood Coalition, a group of men in Ottawa, Black men in Ottawa that have come together to do some things for our community. We'll be joined by them. We would like as many young people to come out. If you need mentorship, if you're interested in employment, if you're interested in business, we have a young Black entrepreneur initiative that's going on. If you want to hear more about that, if you want to hear more about how you can help with our African history classes or send young people that you know might be interested, please, you could join us. It's open. If you're interested in becoming a mentor as well, it's open. So that's next week, 211 Bronson Avenue at 2:30 p.m. Also, November 5th, the school board is putting on a meeting for parents to learn about different initiatives in the school board. It's going to be at Ridgemont High School on Saturday, November 5th. So those of you that are parents or that have children in the school board or possibly will have children in the school board, you're able to come out to learn about the various resources that are available through that. So that's at Ridgemont High School on November 5th. Other than that, I don't have any more announcements. I'll open it up to questions and comments. So Daniel, what do we got?
We have 3 hands up. So David, Mr. Francis, and then Miss Anderson.
Okay.
Thank you. Dr. Ledbetter, you said that this tactic in Algeria was repeated in several other places.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any parallels of that tactic being used in Canada and how the Indigenous people here were displaced? And would that mean that a revolution or something of that nature needs to happen in Canada to put those people who were displaced back in power?
Well, I'll answer the first part first because it's easier. Yes, the main tactic that I'll say definitely was used in Canada is one that's used everywhere, which is the quote unquote civilizing mission. Now, we've had a lot of discussion here in Canada about residential schools, but that school that she attended, even though it was a French school, it's the same type of idea. The idea that one of the ways you can destroy a population is by making it, making the young people alien to their own culture. That's a tried and true tactic of colonialism. You take the young people, you take their language from them, you take their spirituality from them, you take all these cultural markers that have elements of resistance in it, and you take that from them, and then you put on their culture. So we clearly see that in Canada. We see the results of that deculturalization. You see it plainly. And then all the other tactics that go into those schools, the terror, sexual terror, and the other forms of abuse and economic abuse, so on and so forth. So that's just one. I mean, in addition to taking land, because we're in a settler colony. That there's no getting around that. That's what this is. Now, we can do all the land acknowledgments that we want, which I think is. When I came to Canada, I thought that was the biggest piece of disrespectful propaganda I could imagine. I mean, and I think I've said this in these classes, I've said this in other venues. It's like if I came to your house and then I stole your TV, and then every year I told you, yeah, I still got your TV. So, sorry about that. I still got the TV, but yeah, we stole it. I know you didn't give it up. It's unseated. You didn't give it up. I stole it, but I still got it. Like, what's the point of it? If you're not gonna give the TV back, why say it? It don't make no sense. But that's what we're dealing with. You're not giving it back. So if peaceful revolution is possible to repair that, then that's what it should happen. Violence is never something people want to happen, but something needs to be done to rectify this situation. There's no statute of limitations on a theft of that magnitude. So if we want to be on the right side of justice, make sure that you always align yourself with the righteous cause of indigenous freedom and development and not even reparations, because reparations is too light of a term, is an end to settler colonialism. And if that means that if time will come when some of us got to give up some of them deeds to that land or renegotiate those deeds with the rightful owners, we might have to do that. But you got to be ready to be on that side of history, because it's easy to talk about it when we're in these spaces, but that's what it really has to be. So yeah, I think Canada, Australia, Israel, these are perfect examples of those types of settler colonies. United States, of course, and everywhere else. So yeah, Mr. Francis, go ahead.
Thank you for that.
No problem.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I just want to make a comment about Zora Drift. This is a woman, I think, or still is a woman to be admired and respected. Can you imagine the commitment that she must have made with the other suicide girls to avenge what she saw was the wrong that was being done by the colonists? And I don't understand why those people who have looked back over history have not yet learned the lessons.
Mm.
Look at the way the Black Panther was the result of inequities in the American society. The same thing is happening with the Palestinians because of what the Israelis are doing. The Haitians, same thing happens there. So when are these people going to realize that brutality sometimes doesn't achieve the aim they had in mind, but rather it just makes people more more hardened towards the cause of their liberation.
That's it. That's always the result, and people will always resist. And it's unfortunate it has to get to that point sometimes to make people resist, because the slick colonizers, they're the ones that use brutality. Is they always have it, and it's always there. But the slick ones use it as the last resort because they know what happens when you unleash that. So really, it's not hard to get people organized and react to brutality. When George Floyd was killed, our communities erupted. And it happens all the time when we're faced with that type of brutality. But the slick colonizers, they realize the best way to keep you pacified is actually by throwing money at you. And that soft colonization. This is the harder thing to fight against, is the co-optation through that form of colonialism, the gifts, the money, the grants, the gestures, the kneeling, the making this a federal holiday, and this that. That's the stuff that we have to really, really guard against. And it's teaching history like this, making sure that you are constantly reminded about what actually happened. So that way, when you're given a little piecemeal something, you realize that this ain't enough. This is just something to attempt to pacify us. Yeah, and there's a lot going on right now. I mean, if you guys are following, there's a very contested election in Brazil, where you have a Trump. He's even more brutal than Trump, more right wing than Trump, president who's trying to hold on against Lula da Silva, who used to be president a couple administrations ago, who's coming back with the Workers' Party. So that's important for the African world. Was it yesterday? Italy got a new prime minister. This right-wing wannabe Mussolini woman that has now become the new prime minister of Italy. You might think, well, what's that got to do with African people? One of the things that she ran on was cracking down on migrants. And Italy has been one of the places where a lot of Africans from Algeria and Libya and further south are making their way across the Sahara, across the Mediterranean, and getting to Italy because of the neo-colonial situation on the continent. But now, with this right-wing president there, who knows what type of brutality she's going to unleash on African people. So there's a lot of these types of things going down that we need to pay attention to. But you're right. The unwise colonizer will always use brutality, and then it will always result in resistance. And we should keep that up. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Ms. Anderson, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Just two brief questions. Have you heard the term Pied Noir, Blackfoot?
Only in reference to indigenous people.
To who?
Indigenous people. There's a Blackfoot Nation. That's the.
Oh, okay. No, I met someone years ago from Algeria, and then this friend of mine from Haiti said, "Oh, we refer to them as Blackfoot." So they're Africans, so they don't appear to be what they were born on. And it was Algeria in particular that this person came from.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I never heard that, but that makes sense.
Yeah. And the second thing was the announcement you made towards the end of the lecture about next week's event.
Yes.
I'm thinking of a young man who has strong connections with this side, goes to school here, but he lives on the Quebec side. Is it open to?
Oh, yeah. Yes, definitely. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And Ms. Gloria, email me so I can email you the registration information for that young man.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right. Any other questions, comments, or announcements before we close up today? Anything else? Anybody want to announce any community events, anything going on? Any questions about anything? All right, going once, going twice. All right, we'll close up for the day. So everybody, we will meet next week. And next week, we will introduce another woman, introduce some more resistance, and keep the conversation going. So I'll see you all next week.